in this small booklet, if you want to check.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I will try to be as hybridized as possible. I thank you also very much for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity. I really look forward to the next 2 days. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I also think it's a very interesting approach, this transdisciplinary and bringing together people from different sectors working and sharing this similar interest in mobile phones. So I think it's I look forward to this today's process to be very interesting. So having had a look at the program, I thought, how to introduce, how can we get the ball rolling and kick off the debate to stay within the sort of football metaphors of 2010. How do we kick off the debate around mobile phones here? And I thought that maybe a central focus would be on, or a central question in many of these deliberations, debates, is how can mobile phones contribute to democracy and development in Africa? Sometimes, and as Miriam and Professor Ditch also mentioned now, that the assumption is that it does. The assumption is that it will contribute to democracy and development. But I think we need to question that assumption, and we also need to think about if it does, if we accept that assumption, how does it happen? How do we unpack that relationship between ICTs, popular media, and politics? So what I'd like to do here in the next, I think, half an hour that I have, is to just suggest some themes and maybe sort of perspectives on this relationship. The revolution will not be tweeted. That is a recent, very controversial statement by a guy called Malcolm Gladwell. There he is on the screen. He wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine, and he alluded, of course, to Gil Scott-Heron's song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." Yeah. And that piece of his in the New Yorker became an overnight sort of sensation, overnight bone of contention on social networks, and there's a lot of responses that it elicited. I think the fact that the social networks, Twitter and the blogosphere created this debate is also in itself significant. But what Malcolm Gladwell did in his piece is he pointed to the civil rights movement in the American South in the 1960s. It started, the protest movement that he highlights started with a sit-in at a diner in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it ended by engulfing the American South for a decade. And the protests that started there, Malcolm Gladwell insists, happened without email, texting, Facebook, or Twitter. Gladwell says that whereas before activists seemed to be were defined by their causes, they now seem to be defined by their tools. And he said, this is the wrong approach. He said, we have forgotten what activism is. Now, he goes on to explain himself. He says that the type of networks created in online networks, he focuses on Facebook and Twitter in relation to the recent, maybe also euphoric perspectives on what happened in Iran and in China and other places. But I think it's also applicable to what we're going to talk about in terms of mobile phones and politics in Africa. What Gladwell says is that media activism in these networks are based on weak ties and therefore can only demand low-risk participation. But I think if you were to ask Fuad Murtada, who was jailed for impersonating the Moroccan king's brother on Facebook, that what he did is low risk, he might disagree. So would Sheng Jianping, the Chinese woman sent to a labor camp recently for sending a tweet. Or even the Brit Paul Chambers, who was arrested for a joke about blowing up Robin Hood Airport when snowfall spoiled his travel plans. And maybe some of you could share that frustration in the recent days. Tell these people that there are no risks involved with sharing even humorous exchanges on weak tie networks. I think also if you look at Africa, a recent book by Sukari Akin on SMS activism in Africa, the collected views of activists working in Africa using SMS technology to mobilize and to disseminate information. A lot of them would also probably disagree with Gladwell's idea that sharing information on ICT networks is ineffective and there's no risk involved. But in any case, whatever we think about Gladwell's perspective, I think when it comes to Africa, these questions also need to be asked. Is it risk-free? maybe not. But is it effective? And if it's effective, how do we measure that effectiveness? And how does that the exchanges on these networks relate to everyday life and everyday politics in Africa? When it comes to Africa, the contribution of ICTs broadly, but also mobile phones in particular, and the contribution of these ICTs to development and democracy has been widely debated. And there's no consensus yet on the extent to which mobile phones can create an alternative politics or facilitate social change. These assessments often hinge on either foregrounding the structural limitations of technologies, looking at issues of access, political economy, or the nature of the medium, the fact that the medium creates weak ties, or that people, that the medium itself limits the way that people communicate. Or on the other hand, people celebrate the agency of its users, looking at the creative adaptations and domestications of these technologies. And I think we need to do both. But and what I'd like to highlight today, and I think also what probably what in this workshop is going to be done is emphasizing also the latter, the way in which technologies are integrated in people's everyday lives, and then trying to understand how that integration has implications for politics and social change. So depending on where we put that emphasis, it looks like assessing the impact or effect of new media technologies, including mobile phones, seems often to be a case of the glass being either half full or half empty. Those that prefer to see the glass half full might say that Gladwell is a bit too late. The revolution has already taken place. They will talk with enthusiasm about how Africans have embraced mobile phones. They tell you anecdotes like Russell Southwood does in his recent book on how African consumers literally have broken down doors to get to shops, to get to mobile phones. He mentions, again, there's anecdotes of police having to control over-enthusiastic customers. And they will point you to the figures that are indeed astounding. And statistics are always, in terms of ICTs, very flexible and sometimes difficult to pinpoint the correct statistics. But around roughly 350 million mobile phone subscribers on the continent. And we've heard now that subscription itself is not necessarily the best indicator, but still it is an indicator of how popular it is. That represents a phenomenal 550% rise in take-up in the 5 years between 2003 and 2008. In most countries in Africa, average penetration is more than a third of the population. In some countries like Gabon, Seychelles, South Africa, almost 100% penetration. But again, we have to be cautious about these figures, and these figures do not even tell us the full story of access, because people share handsets, people have more than one subscription, or they have different ways of connecting. But because of this, at least ostensible indicators of the high take-up, mobiles are often considered ideal vehicles for the deepening of democracy or the development in Africa, the whole sector of which many of you represent. Yeah, the ICT 4D, ICT for development, I think is premised on the promise of mobile phones, the promise that mobile phones have to deepen democracy and to increase development on the continent, especially because they enable users to leapfrog. The idea of a leapfrog is we often hear leapfrog the fixed line infrastructure, which in many areas of Africa is lacking. These mobile optimists will also point out that phones are used for much more than making calls. There are, as my colleague Guy Berger has mentioned in the column, 1,001 uses of mobile phones that extend far beyond voice communication. African users use mobiles to send texts, to transfer money. The M-Pesa system there that's doing very well in Kenya, but also recently brought into South Africa. M-Pesa, money transfers is a key activity. They check market prices for agricultural products. They monitor elections. They send and receive public health or emergency messages. And these case studies, I think, or many of them, we will hear in much detail from the people involved with them that have expert knowledge about them. But apart from these perhaps more serious uses of mobiles, Africans also use mobiles in their everyday lives to take photographs, to make films, to even watch television is being rolled out. They search the internet, and yes, they Facebook and they tweet. They use Twitter, social networks. So there are many more uses than just sort of voice communication, as we all know. And that's the versatility of these mobile phones, also part of this promise that they hold, because they are versatile and flexible technologies. So there is a big promise of mobile phones, and there's a big enthusiasm, and that enthusiasm, if perhaps in some cases is over-exaggerated or maybe over-enthusiastic, there is certainly a lot to be excited about. But history has also taught us to take claims of revolutions in Africa with a pinch of salt. We also have to be cautious about social change and the so-called revolutions that will take place. We've heard in the beginning of the 90s already, when ICTs were fairly new and research around ICTs started to emerge in Africa, of this link between new media and democratic politics. And from the 90s onwards, initially there was these debates have been marked by optimism, and as Fred Mudai in their book says that it's almost utopian bliss for new technologies, euphoria around the introduction of these technologies. And often this euphoria has been based, as Miriam has also said, on technologically determinist assumptions that all you have to do is introduce technologies into a society and change will follow. And that technological determinism, as we know, is also related to older views of development in Africa, the older views of transmission, older views of a universal linear trajectory that all societies will form part of, and that mobile phones and ICTs will enable Africans to, again, leapfrog some of that stages in that linear trajectory. But as the years went on, since the 1990s, we saw that that frog in Africa, actually, his movements were much more difficult to predict. And the frog didn't jump in the ways that we had expected. And that raised, again, questions around, older questions around access, inequality, power, control, quality of information. So those questions are still with us, and I think they are still important. For many Africans, handsets are very expensive. Running costs are very high. A recent study with one of my colleagues, again, in Grahamstown, a small town in the poorest province of South Africa, it must be said, but still, I think it's also indicative of larger trends, showed that informal settlement dwellers, people living in shacks in that town, spent about 27.5% of their income on communication costs. And they used some of the money that they would have put aside, or they had put aside for food and basic essentials, to communicate, because they know if they're cut off from the communication network, then they also lose job opportunities, and they are sort of marginalized even further. But it creates a problem. So we have to talk about the class aspects, we have to talk about the political economy, and we also have to talk about the gendered aspect of it, because that same study also looked at the fact that women are often marginalized more than men in terms of the political economy of access, and that again has a further effect on extended families and family circles. So, as we know that African users are often limited to using functions like beeping or please call me, free services. Recently, Facebook also announced Facebook Zero, where people can access Facebook for free even if you don't have credit. So, and I'll return to that idea of beeping and please call me, because that also poses an interesting perspective on how people actually use these technologies. But it remains the fact that there are limits, and that it's not a free-for-all. It's not a question of the revolution has suddenly equalized everybody. So that's perhaps the glass half-empty perspective. But the glass half-full perspective would also show us that there's no doubt that mobile phones have changed social practices around the world, around the continent. Russell Southwood, in his book, sums it up with the title, "There's less walk and more talk." So it's decreased physical distances, and I think we can also say it is decreased in many regards social and economic and political distances between people and between organizations. So there's certainly room to also celebrate the fact that it has made life easier for many people. It has changed the way that people communicate and changed the way people live their daily lives. And even if the political economy of access is sometimes restrictive, there's also the creative appropriation of these technologies and the ways that people circumvent these limitations. And African users display often remarkable creativity in overcoming the obstacles put in their way by exorbitant pricing structures and by the political economy. I've mentioned the beeping or the flashing. People would develop codes or protocols to decode the way in which people use this, to use these free services to communicate. There are many examples, like the picture of street vendors providing services, of people bringing their phones to central vendors to get charged because the electricity is not always available. So all these ways of circumventing the limitations, I think we need to celebrate and we have to focus on. But we also have to ask questions about what does that mean for social change and politics in Africa. So if we get back to the original question of how do mobile phones impact on political change, on social change, on development, I think this creative appropriation and adaptation of phones is a very productive area for us to focus on and for our research as well. So these examples of creative adoption and adaptation by African users of mobile phones show us that, or I think pose interesting questions for democratic citizenship and everyday understandings of political participation in Africa. And that is what I'd like to just briefly focus on in the time remaining. There is time remaining, right? The view of mobile phones as radically new technologies that will revolutionize African societies is sometimes also based maybe on a patronizing ideological assumption that technological progress is only a benevolent force for the underdeveloped South. And I think we have moved beyond that. I think people realize that technological determinism is not an acceptable way of looking at what mobile phones could mean, but I still sometimes I think it still underpins some of our thinking. But even if we get away from the sort of old cruder ways of technological determinism, I think we can look at mobile phones in more than one way, and we can look at the impact in terms of transmission and in terms of transgression. Those two terms I'd like to talk about briefly. I think if we talk about the transmission model of mobile phones and what they mean for social change and democracy, we are concerned with issues of distribution and access. We are concerned with issues of effect. How do the mobile phones transmit information? How do people, even if from the ground up, even if we look at it from not only from a top-down perspective, how do we use mobile phones to transmit information that could deepen democracy and broaden development? But I would like to argue that we can also look at mobile phones in terms of transgression. We also look at mobile phones in terms of how they transgress boundaries, how they can transgress the limitations that are imposed on people by the state, by culture, by economy, and also by technology itself, the coupling of technology and capitalism, big business, because mobile phones are big business as well in Africa. It's not most of the times it's not a philanthropic exercise. So we also have to think critically about how people actually use mobile phones to transgress the limitations imposed on them by the mobile phone companies. So if we look at both transmission and transgression, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that in a moment. If we look at both these aspects, I think the question of whether the revolution shall be tweeted takes on a different form. Then the idea of Gladwell that the revolution shall not be tweeted, I think often relies on a too rigid separation of the political and the seemingly mundane, a separation between democratic participation and political culture, a separation between civic, social identities, online and offline worlds. I think increasingly we have to think about how these are integrated, how we integrate the popular, the everyday, with the political and the development discourses. And that is actually why mobile phones are so interesting, because mobile phones tend to blur and redraw the boundaries between the private and the public. And this blurring of the private-public divide is sometimes, I think, perhaps disconcerting for observers who prefer politics in Africa to be rational and deliberative and want to keep that clear separation. But mobile phones have exciting and very promising potential for actually understanding the private as political and the popular as having serious public implications. So instead of dismissing text chats and social networking, musical downloads, gossip, etc., as having no revolutionary potential, we can actually try and find ways of how those popular users help people to transgress the realm of the private into the realm of the public. So to be a bit more academic, maybe, not only Habermas will help us, not only the rational deliberation of the public sphere, but also Bachtin, also the carnival and the celebration, the popular, the pleasures of everyday life. And I think we need to connect those two worlds. So how does this transmission and transgression take place? Let me end by just highlighting some of the themes in the program and posing perhaps some questions of how we can look at these themes in terms of transmission and transgression. One of the themes, key themes I think in the literature as well, is about state and media, relationship between state and media. And of course in Africa that has been a conflictual and a contested relationship. And there's a lot of talk about the promise that mobile phones have for things like e-democracy or network politics. The advent of ICTs, especially mobile phones, have been seen as ways where citizens can communicate more easily with politicians, and governments can communicate more easily with the citizenry. We see these examples of election monitoring, for instance, all aware, I'm sure, of the Ushahidi platform that's been used all over Africa and all over the world, it seems, to monitor elections and monitor crises. Picture there is of also of the coalition of domestic election observers in Ghana recently, where people could send SMSs to election observation. In South Africa, political parties in the last election in 2009 also used mobile phones to send information to the election to the voters. So we see these examples of e-democracy and e-governance emerging. But we also have to look at the moments between these formal elections. What happens between formal elections? And that's also where mobile phones, I think, is perhaps even more interesting and more exciting. It's the promise that they hold for social movements and organizations on the ground. The picture there is from abahlali.org, Abahlali Base Monjola in South Africa's shack dwellers organization that's been a lot in the news recently because they are successfully using the media also to create awareness and set an agenda. And that picture there was a shack fire that was taken by a mobile phone, sent onto the web, and I think also to news organizations. So you see the mobile phone also as a tool in the hands of citizen journalists to make people aware of what happens in communities that often fall outside of the radar of formal media. So we can see that mobile phones hold a promise not only for formal politics, elections, but also for what happens in between those formal political moments. But again, we have to be cautious and we have to be careful and remember that these campaigns are often still hampered by unequal access to mobile social networks. Subaltern counter-publics do not always gain access to the mediatized public sphere. Abahlali, perhaps an exception. Perhaps these some of the social movements have managed to use the mobile phones and ICTs to create awareness around their plight, but it doesn't happen everywhere, and a lot of people are still excluded. So we also have to look further than this sort of formal democratic participation, and we have to look at for more informal ways of how people use ICTs to communicate. Now, people use ICTs also in the private sphere, the popular sphere, but it has a political dimension. And that's where the idea of transgression, I think, comes in. People use mobile phones to transgress the limitations of the public sphere and the media sphere. For instance, the circulation of gossip, rumors, jokes, so-called SMS wars. There's a case study also recently of during the previous elections, how people from the opposing camps within the ANC also used SMSs to pit war between candidates, circulating rumors, falsehoods. So if we look at politics from a rational perspective, perhaps the way that a lot of NGOs and democracy consultants in Africa want to see politics, we also see that mobile phones erodes that, and then sometimes it creates a sort of moral panic. It creates a problem for them. And so, well, mobile phones actually subverts this rational communication in the public sphere. But we can also look at that in a more positive light, because we can see how people use satire, use jokes through mobile phones and ICTs to perhaps perpetuate what has been called radio trottoir, the pavement radio in Africa. So increasingly, I think pavement radio in Africa is becoming also ICTized. It becomes online radio trottoir. And I'm quite interested in how satire and jokes in Africa function also to complement more rational deliberations in the political sphere. In South Africa, again, we have seen recently a lot of satirical websites, for instance, Zan News and Late Night News with Loyiso Gwala, and this picture there is of a Twitter campaign almost to satirize Julius Malema, the president of the ANC Youth League, who recently became very upset because there were a lot of fake Twitter accounts in his name, and he said Twitter should be closed down, and then sort of reaction on the Twitter sphere. Again, I mean, it's limited, it's maybe a middle-class activity, but I think it's an indication also of how people try to use these ICTs to transgress, to go outside the formal boundaries of public sphere and what we think political debate should be. They find new ways of political debate, new modes of political discussion. Another category in the conference I see is ICTs and local politics. And local politics, of course, has been also a focus point for ICTs and mobile phones because it holds the promise of ordinary people on a local level communicating with politicians and authorities. Citizen journalism is another example of one of the trends that has been celebrated a lot, saying citizen journalism now, everybody with a mobile phone can be a journalist. And yes, it's true in many ways. Again, that's forgive me for being slightly parochial. It's again from a small town, Grahamstown in South Africa, but we have a very interesting project there called Indaba Ziyafika. The news is coming, where we train citizen journalists and help them work with the local newspaper. And they use SMSs. People use SMSs to send them to the local newspaper that gets published. And it falls outside maybe of the boundaries of formal journalism. But again, we can be critical about citizen journalism, not only in terms of access, but also in terms of voice. What do we expect of citizen journalists? We still expect of them to participate in the mainstream media sphere. We still expect them to communicate in the norms and the practices of mainstream media. So we also have to look at how people perhaps choose not to do that. How they might say, well, I'm not going to participate. I'm going to use my mobile phone for something else entirely. I don't want to consult. I don't want to debate. I want to protest. So direct democracy, the way that the so-called weapons of the weak that might be frowned upon by people that prefer politics to be rational and deliberative in the public sphere, might pose interesting questions for us. I'll move on quickly to another theme of the conference, technology development and knowledge. Again, we can look at this from two perspectives. We can say, yes, from the transmission perspective, and I'm not dismissing the transmission perspective. I'm not dismissing that. I'm just trying to complement that. So from the transmission perspective, we can say, like Russell Southwood does in his book, he cites examples of rural farmers who would, before mobile phones, had to travel to markets to get stock prices, etc. Now they can use mobile phones, so there's less walk and more talk. I think that has undoubtedly improved the lives of many people. The transmission of information, the way that people use mobile phones also to transmit money, remittances, using mobile phones as wallets. These are all important perspectives. But in terms of transgression, another perspective is also how people use mobile phones to transgress the formal economy, to create informal economies. And that's where a different type of technological knowledge comes in. It's not the formal knowledge, perhaps, of knowing what goes on in the stock market, knowing what goes on in the formal economy, but it's about knowing how to unblock a phone's SIM card. It's about knowing how to connect to different networks to optimize free minutes. It's about knowing how to Bluetooth music to your friends so you can create social capital, knowing how to flash or beep, send please call me, so that even if you have no credit, you can still communicate. All of these knowledges, alternative knowledges, creates not only real capital but also social capital. Southwood calls mobile phones the sports car of its age in Africa because it's also a desirable aspirational status symbol. So we have to think about economy and capital also in different ways, and now mobile phones enable people to transgress the formal limits there. I'm conscious that I have to stop, so I'm just going to show a quick last example. Another theme here is the theme of calling in Africa, calling from Africa. Amartya Sen said mobile phones are generally taken to be freedom enhancing. So if mobile phones are freedom enhancing, what do we expect people to do with that freedom? A lot of the expectation is that Africans can now connect outside, connect to a broader world, to the globalized world. But some studies also suggest that they connect more inward to smaller networks, and that type of connections are very often not political in nature. Mixit, the very sort of a flourishing social network in South Africa where people connect via mobile phones and chat through an internet-based platform for much cheaper than they can for SMSs. It's a huge network, so 20 million users. Some claims that even more messages are sent on Mixit than on Twitter globally every day. But Mixit is very explicitly non-political. In the previous elections, political parties approached them and said, can we please use your very popular platform to transmit political messages? And they said, no, we don't want politics here. So how do we think about that? Do we think about that as a failure of mobile communications? Do we think about that as a limitation? Or do we concentrate on that and say, why do people do this? Why do people engage in this? Does it help people to transgress the limits of their identities, transgress their own maybe gendered identities? Or in fact, does it reinforce them? Because there's also a lot of negative things to be said about what goes on in these networks. And it's not only sort of the moral panic of sexual content. There are a lot of moral panics around how Mixit is used to break up relationships and break up marriages and underage sexual activity. Another site in South Africa, Haute Toilette, recently also came under fire, became blocked for sexual violence and child pornography. So there's a lot of worrying tendencies there as well. So we have to, I think these are the areas where we have to think about in terms of how people communicate in and from Africa. So let me close to say that I think if we think about democracy, about social change, development in Africa, the way in which mobile phones enable transmission of information, enable transmission of capital, put people into contact with global worlds, I think that's very important. But I think we need to complement that also by an understanding of democracy, social change and development in everyday life. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next 2 days actually falls within that area. So I think that is very interesting. We have to think about technology and society in interaction. So when we focus on these intersections of the popular and the political and the practices of everyday democracy, we can see how mobile phones are used by people not only to transmit democratic and civic information, but also as a location where people are transgressing the fixed boundaries of what counts exactly as political participation or civic identification. So if you allow me just to close on a very personal note, I was a student in Leiden 12 years ago, and I bought a poster here by a Dutch poet called Remco Kampert. And it still hangs in my, and I don't know if it's very unfashionable maybe in the Netherlands, I don't know anything about the poet, but it's a poster that still hangs in my study, and it begins with the lines, Verzet begint niet met grote woorden, maar met kleine daden. Resistance, and maybe in this context we can talk about revolution, doesn't start with big words, but it starts with small deeds. And I think if we talk about what happens in Africa and around mobile phones, we have to concentrate on these small deeds, these everyday deeds of resistance and revolution, and that I think will lead to a better understanding of what happens around mobile phones in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very